Did you know that a foreign power came within minutes of shooting down Air Force One with the President of the United States inside? Deep within the shadows of a foreign summit, an elite group of military commanders thought they had designed the perfect trap, but they had no idea their execution orders would become their own death warrants. Before we uncover the classified details of this silent shadow war, hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and share this video with someone who needs to see the truth behind the headlines. Imagine standing on a cold runway in Turkey during a high-stakes NATO summit. The air is thick with tension, and the tarmac is lined with security personnel from dozens of nations. Sitting quietly on the concrete is the most famous aircraft in human history, Air Force One. With its iconic blue and white paint, its massive four-engine frame, and its advanced defensive systems, it is a flying fortress designed to withstand electronic warfare, radar tracking, and even nuclear blasts. It is a symbol of absolute global power. But on this specific day, behind the closed doors of international diplomacy, that massive aircraft was nothing more than a giant sitting target. Deep within the communication networks of the Middle East, a silent alarm had just gone off. The Mossad, Israel's highly secretive intelligence agency, had intercepted a series of encrypted signals originating from Tehran. The messages were highly specific, containing flight paths, scheduled departure times, and coordinates around the Turkish airfield. The intelligence was terrifyingly clear. An elite team of operatives, directed by the highest levels of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, was already in position near the perimeter of the airport. Their weapon of choice was not a massive anti-aircraft battery that could be spotted by satellites. It was a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile, commonly known as a MANPADS. To understand why this sent a wave of sheer panic through the Secret Service and the presidential security detail, you have to understand how these weapons work. A shoulder-fired missile can be easily hidden in the trunk of a standard sedan. It can be carried by a single person through thick brush, forest terrain, or urban alleys. It does not require a radar system to lock onto its target. Instead, it uses an advanced infrared seeker to track the immense heat signatures pouring out of an aircraft's jet engines. When a massive Boeing 747 like Air Force One is taking off, it is low to the ground, heavy with fuel, and moving relatively slowly. In those critical first 2 minutes of flight, the plane is incredibly vulnerable. A missile fired from a hidden position just outside the airport fence would have a travel time of only a few seconds. Even the most advanced missile defense systems in the world struggle to react when the launch occurs from such a short distance. The Israeli intelligence officers conveyed the threat to their American counterparts with absolute urgency. They did not just have a general warning. They had the tactical details. The assassins were waiting. They were watching the runway. They were waiting for that unmistakable blue and white nose to lift into the air. If Air Force One took off as scheduled, there was a very real, very terrifying chance that the President of the United States would not survive the day. Inside the command center, a desperate, silent battle was being fought. The standard protocol for a presidential departure is incredibly strict, but it relies on the host nation securing the outer perimeter of the airport. In this case, the Turkish security forces had failed to detect the threat. The perimeter was too vast, the hills surrounding the airport were too rugged, and there was simply no time to conduct a massive sweep without alerting the public and the assassins themselves. If the security team made a loud, sudden show of force, the assassins might realize their plot had been discovered and launch a desperate attack on the presidential motorcade instead. This led to one of the most bizarre, humiliating, and ultimately life-saving decisions in the history of presidential security. The Secret Service decided to use absolute deception. They had to smuggle the President of the United States off his own plane without anyone realizing he was gone. While the massive Air Force One sat fully lit on the tarmac, acting as a giant, glittering decoy, a plan was set in motion. The security team located a humble, unmarked catering truck. This was the kind of industrial vehicle used to load plastic trays of food, water, and ice onto commercial flights. It was dirty, dented, and completely unremarkable. Under the cover of darkness, while the eyes of foreign intelligence agents and potential spotters were glued to the primary runway, the President of the United States was quietly ushered into the back of this catering truck. Surrounded by metal food carts and the smell of stale airline meals, the leader of the free world was slowly driven across the tarmac. The truck moved at a normal, boring pace, blending in perfectly with the airport's daily ground traffic. It drove past the security gates and traveled to a completely different, isolated hangar on the far side of the airfield. There, a smaller, civilian-looking transport aircraft was waiting with its engines idling. The President was quickly transferred from the back of the food truck into the cabin of the unmarked plane. Minutes later, the smaller aircraft slipped into the night sky, completely unnoticed by the assassins who were still staring through their thermal scopes at the empty Air Force One parked on the main runway. It was a brilliant tactical escape. The plot had been foiled, and the President was safe. But back in Washington, inside the quiet corridors of the Pentagon and the White House, the mood was not one of relief. It was a mood of cold, focused, and absolute fury. A foreign adversary had just attempted to assassinate the President of the United States on foreign soil. They had come within minutes of succeeding. This was not a minor diplomatic incident. This was an act of war conducted in the dark. The standard political response would have been to make a dramatic public announcement, hold a press conference, and threaten military action. But the administration knew that a loud public response would only play into the hands of the Iranian regime. Tehran wanted to show its followers that it could terrify the West. They wanted to project strength and defiance. The American administration decided that they would not give them that satisfaction. Instead, they chose a path of silent, devastating, and systematic retaliation. To understand why this specific plot was hatched, you have to understand the deep, simmering anger within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, particularly the elite Quds force. For years, these generals had operated with complete impunity across the Middle East. They had orchestrated proxy wars in Yemen, funded militant groups in Lebanon, and directed attacks against American troops in Iraq. They viewed themselves as untouchable masters of shadow warfare. But the geopolitical landscape had shifted dramatically. The American administration had shown a willingness to bypass traditional diplomatic channels and strike directly at the heart of the regime's military command. The loss of their top military strategists in previous precision strikes had left a massive void in their leadership. The new generation of Iranian generals felt immense pressure to prove themselves. They needed to show their supreme leader, their troops, and their regional allies that they were still capable of striking fear into the heart of their greatest enemy. They did not want a conventional war that they knew they would lose. Instead, they wanted a spectacular, historic strike that would throw the Western political system into absolute chaos. They believed that if they could successfully eliminate the American president during a major international summit, the United States would be so consumed by internal political turmoil, grief, and confusion that it would withdraw its forces from the Middle East entirely. It was a massive, desperate gamble, and they had no idea that their failure would trigger a silent campaign of erasure that would target every single person who signed off on the operation. The American intelligence services immediately went to work. They did not just want to find the foot soldiers who carried the missiles in Turkey. They wanted the architects. They wanted the men who sat in the carpeted conference rooms in Tehran, drinking tea and looking at maps of Turkish airports. They wanted the generals who authorized the funds, the logistics officers who smuggled the weapons across international borders, and the commanders who gave the final go-ahead. A highly classified target list was compiled. The names on this list were not shared with the media. There were no public warnings. But within days of the failed plot, the pieces of a global trap began to slide into place. If you want to help us keep uncovering these classified stories that the mainstream media tries to sweep under the rug, please join our growing community of truth seekers. Smash that thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Now, let's get back to the moment everything changed. The first phase of the American response was not physical, but economic and strategic. The administration recognized that a military regime cannot function without money. They cannot pay their assassins, they cannot purchase advanced weaponry, and they cannot maintain the loyalty of their officers if their treasury is empty. The decision was made to establish an absolute economic blockade of Iran's vital maritime trade routes. This was not a standard set of sanctions that could be easily bypassed through front companies and shell banks. This was a physical, military blockade of the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. The Strait of Hormuz is one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. It is a narrow strip of water separating the Persian Gulf from the open ocean. Through this tiny corridor passes nearly 20% of the world's daily petroleum supply. For decades, the Iranian regime had used the threat of closing the strait as their ultimate geopolitical shield. Whenever the international community pressured them over their nuclear program or their support for terrorism, the generals in Tehran would threaten to block the strait, send global oil prices skyrocketing to $200 a barrel, and trigger a global economic collapse. They believed this threat made them untouchable, but the U.S. Navy decided to call their bluff. A massive armada of warships, aircraft carriers, destroyers, and advanced surveillance assets was deployed to the region. The president made it clear to the global community that the United States was taking total control of the Strait of Hormuz. The military set up a strict, unyielding naval blockade. Every vessel entering or leaving the region was monitored, tracked, and subject to boarding and inspection. The goal was simple: to stop the flow of Iranian oil completely and prevent any illicit weapons or resources from entering Iranian ports. The Iranian regime was stunned. They expected diplomatic protests and endless debates at the United Nations. They did not expect a wall of American steel to drop right on their doorstep. In a desperate attempt to test the resolve of the blockade, the regime authorized a series of covert shipping maneuvers. They utilized foreign-flagged vessels, hoping that the U.S. military would not dare to target a ship flying the flag of a neutral nation. One such incident involved a Panama-flagged cargo ship that attempted to slip through the blockade in the Gulf of Oman. The ship ignored multiple radio warnings from U.S. Navy vessels. The captain, operating under direct orders from Iranian handlers, believed that the Americans were bluffing. They assumed that the U.S. would not risk an international incident over a merchant vessel. They were dead wrong. As the ship continued its course toward an Iranian port, an MH-60 Seahawk helicopter rose from the deck of a nearby U.S. destroyer. The helicopter swept across the choppy gray waters of the Gulf, its thermal sensors locking onto the target. Inside the cockpit, the pilots received final clearance from their commanders. 2 Hellfire missiles leaped from the helicopter's launchers, leaving trails of white smoke against the sky. The missiles did not strike the hull to sink the ship. That would have caused an environmental disaster and cost innocent lives. Instead, with terrifying surgical precision, the Hellfires slammed directly into the vessel's engine room. The double explosion tore through the heart of the ship's propulsion system, instantly disabling the vessel and leaving it dead in the water. There were no casualties, but the message was received loud and clear by every shipping company, navy, and government in the world. The U.S. military was not playing games. If you tried to violate the blockade, your ship would be neutralized. The illusion of Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz had been shattered in a matter of seconds. The economic consequences of this blockade were immediate and devastating. When a nation's ability to export its primary resource is completely cut off, its economy does not just decline, it implodes. The Iranian rial plummeted to historic lows. Inflation inside the country soared to an incredible 300%. The basic necessities of life, from flour and rice to clean water and medicine, became impossibly expensive for the average citizen. The regime, which had spent decades funding foreign wars and building massive arsenals of drones and missiles, suddenly found itself without the funds to pay its own domestic security forces. Imagine being a soldier or an officer in an authoritarian regime. You're asked to suppress protests, guard military installations, and risk your life for the state. But when you receive your paycheck, you realize that your monthly salary is barely enough to buy a single week's worth of groceries for your family. The morale of the standing army began to disintegrate. Unpaid soldiers began deserting their posts, and local commanders struggled to maintain discipline. The very foundation of the regime's domestic power was beginning to crack under the weight of the economic chokehold. But while the economic war was playing out in the public eye, a much more terrifying and quiet campaign was taking place in the shadows. The list of names that had been compiled after the Turkish assassination plot was being systematically cleared. The generals who had designed, funded, and authorized the plan to shoot down Air Force One began to realize that they were being hunted. But this was not a war of loud explosions and public battles. This was a war of silent erasure. In Tehran, a senior commander of the Quds Force, who had been instrumental in smuggling the shoulder-fired missiles into Turkey, was driving home late at night. His vehicle was heavily armored, and he traveled with a professional security detail. But as his car entered a quiet stretch of highway, a sudden blinding flash of light occurred. There was no massive blast wave that damaged surrounding buildings. There was only a highly localized, incredibly precise impact that tore through the passenger cabin of his vehicle, leaving the driver and the surrounding security guards completely untouched. The commander was dead before his security detail even realized they were under attack. A week later, a top logistics general who managed the regime's covert operations in Europe and Turkey suffered a sudden, massive heart attack in his sleep. He was in his early 50s, in excellent physical health, and lived in a highly secured military compound. His death was officially ruled as natural causes, but the remaining members of his command knew better. They knew that modern intelligence agencies possessed silent, undetectable substances that could mimic natural cardiac arrest without leaving a trace in a standard autopsy. Then came the disappearances. In Lebanon, a key liaison officer who coordinated between the IRGC and local militant groups stepped out of his secure apartment in Beirut to meet a contact. He never arrived. His body was never found. His phone was turned off, his bank accounts remained untouched, and his safe house was left completely undisturbed. It was as if he had simply vanished from the face of the earth. One by one, the men who had sat in that secret room in Tehran, laughing as they planned the destruction of Air Force One, were being quietly, efficiently removed from the board. The level of paranoia within the Iranian military command reached an absolute fever pitch. The remaining generals realized that their security apparatus was completely compromised. They did not know if their phones were being tapped, if their drivers were double agents, or if their food was being poisoned. They stopped sleeping in the same location for more than a single night. They refused to use electronic communications, relying instead on handwritten notes carried by trusted couriers. They stayed deep inside underground bunkers, cut off from the world, terrified that the moment they stepped into the daylight, they would be erased. As we watch these historic events unfold, we want to know what you think. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on how this silent war is being handled. And if you're enjoying this deep dive, take a quick second to support our independent channel by liking, subscribing, and sharing this video with your friends. Your support is what keeps us going. Let's look at what happened next. To understand the full scope of this conflict, we have to look at the broader strategic game that was being played. The Iranian regime knew that they could not defeat the United States military in a direct conflict. They knew their economy was bleeding out and that their leadership was being systematically dismantled. But they had one final card to play. They looked at the calendar. They saw the upcoming United States midterm elections as their ultimate lifeline. Authoritarian regimes are highly adept at studying the political cycles of democratic nations. The generals in Tehran understood that the American political system is highly sensitive to public opinion, economic stability, and international chaos. Hay believed that if they could create a massive wave of global instability in the months leading up to the election, they could influence the outcome. They wanted to make the American administration look weak, disorganized, and incapable of managing foreign crises. Their strategy was to create so much chaos that the American public would grow tired of the tension and demand a shift in policy. They hoped that a political change in Washington would lead to a divided government, paralyzing the administration's foreign policy and forcing them to lift the naval blockade. They believed that if they could just survive a few more months, they could outlast the pressure and force the United States back to the negotiating table from a position of strength. To execute this plan, the regime activated its vast network of proxy forces. They did not want to launch direct attacks from Iranian soil, which would invite immediate and devastating military retaliation. Instead, they ordered their proxies to do the dirty work. The most active of these proxies was the Houthi rebel movement in Yemen. The Houthis, who had been armed, trained, and funded by the IRGC for years, began launching waves of drones, ballistic missiles, and anti-ship cruise missiles into the critical shipping lanes of the Red Sea. The goal of these attacks was simple: to disrupt global trade, drive up shipping insurance rates, and force international maritime companies to reroute their cargo ships around the entire continent of Africa. This would add weeks to transit times and cost billions of dollars, ultimately driving up the price of goods and fuel for consumers in the West. The Iranian regime believed that this economic pain would translate into political anger in the United States, forcing the administration to back down. But once again, the generals in Tehran completely miscalculated the global response. Instead of capitulating to the pressure, the international community began to adapt in a way that would permanently alter the geopolitical map of the Middle East. The major Arab Gulf nations, including Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, had grown incredibly tired of Iran's constant threats to the global economy. They realized that as long as their oil exports had to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, their entire national wealth was hostage to the whims of the regime in Tehran. They decided to make the Strait of Hormuz completely obsolete. The Gulf nations accelerated the construction of a massive network of overland pipelines. These high-capacity pipelines were designed to transport millions of barrels of oil directly from the oil fields of the Persian Gulf, across the vast deserts of the Arabian Peninsula, to massive export terminals on the Red Sea and the Gulf of Oman. These new routes were located hundreds of miles away from Iranian waters, completely out of reach of their small attack boats and coastal missile batteries. Within a year and a half, the infrastructure projects were nearing completion. The world was building a global energy map where the Strait of Hormuz did not matter anymore. By trying to weaponize their geographic position, the Iranian regime had forced the rest of the world to build a world without them. They were losing their only real source of international leverage. Once the pipelines were fully operational, the Strait of Hormuz would become nothing more than a quiet, empty waterway, and the Iranian regime would have no way to threaten the global economy ever again. This was a catastrophic, self-inflicted defeat for the regime. While their generals were being erased and their economy was turning to dust, the very asset they relied on for geopolitical power was being rendered completely worthless. The tragedy of this situation was felt most acutely by the ordinary people of Iran. They were the ones who had to live with the reality of a collapsing nation. While the corrupt leadership spent billions of dollars on proxy wars, failed assassination plots, and ballistic missile programs, average families could not even afford basic medicine for their children. The contrast between the regime's loud, aggressive public propaganda and the miserable reality of daily life in Iran was stark. The state-controlled television networks would broadcast highly produced videos of military parades, showing off new suicide drones and marching soldiers, while just down the street, elderly citizens stood in mile-long lines in the blistering heat, waiting for a government handout of cooking oil and bread. The anger among the population was growing, and the regime had to rely on increasingly brutal methods to suppress protests and maintain their grip on power. General Jack Keane, one of the most respected military minds in the United States, provided a highly sobering analysis of the situation. He warned that, as the regime grew more desperate, The danger of unpredictable, violent outbursts would increase. When an authoritarian regime realizes that its days are numbered, that its economy is dead, and that its leadership is being systematically destroyed, they often lash out in a final desperate attempt to survive. But Keane also pointed out that the regime's actual military capability was only a fraction of what it had been in previous years. The blockade had starved them of the replacement parts, advanced electronics, and raw materials needed to maintain a modern military forces. Their remaining aircraft were decades old, their naval vessels were poorly maintained, and their soldiers were hungry and unpaid. Any offensive action they could muster would be easily countered by the overwhelming power of the U.S. military and its regional allies. The silent war of attrition had worked. The United States had successfully neutralized a major, active threat to its national security without launching a massive, bloody land war that would have cost thousands of lives. They had used a masterclass in gray zone warfare, combining absolute economic pressure, strategic isolation, and highly precise intelligence operations to systematically dismantle the leadership of their adversary. As we look back at the chain of events that began on that cold runway in Turkey, the lesson is clear. The generals who sat in that secret room in Tehran believed they could alter the course of human history with a single, cowardly strike against Air Force One. They thought they could operate in the dark, using proxies and hidden assassins to escape consequences. They believed that their power, their position, and their borders would protect them from the wrath of the world's greatest superpower. But they forgot that the wheels of justice, though they may grind slowly, grind exceedingly fine. They wanted to write their names in history as heroes of a global revolution. Instead, they were erased from the board in silence, leaving behind a nation in ruins, a collapsed economy, and a military command that is too terrified to step into the light. Their plots failed, their weapons were disabled, and their names have been forgotten. The flying fortress of Air Force One still takes off into the blue sky, carrying the symbol of American resolve across the globe, while the men who tried to bring it down have been quietly, permanently erased from history.